I welcome you all to this Zycus-sponsored webinar held in association with IACCM. As both commercial and government organizations strive to manage the complexity of their contracts, streamlining and optimizing negotiations continues to be an area of significant return. In a recent survey, 4 out of 5 IACCM members saw a greater need for collaboration and that negotiation in the future will be more of a continuum. So, in this webinar, we will explore how thought leaders are crafting the future shape of negotiations. We encourage all the participants to participate actively in this webcast by asking questions and posting comments or feedback. You will see a space in the bottom left corner of your screen. Our speakers today are subject matter experts with a rich experience in the contract management domain. On behalf of everyone present, I welcome the speakers for today, Tim Cummins and Richard Waugh. Tim is the CEO and President of IACCM. In this capacity, he routinely works with leading corporations, public and academic bodies supporting executive awareness and understanding the role that procurement, contracting, and relationship management play in business performance and public policy today. Richard Waugh is VP Corporate Development at Zycus. He has an extensive background in B2B e-commerce, going back to his early career at GE, where he helped launch GE's Trading Process Network, the first online marketplace for sourcing and procurement in the mid-90s. He was the co-founder for B2E Markets, the first software-as-a-service sourcing suite providers. So, without further ado, I invite Tim to start with the presentation.
Thank you, Rohan. So it's great to be with you again for this program, and we're going to cover a lot of ground today. As you said at the beginning, we've seen very clear trends from our members, but also I think from the press, from management magazines and media more generally about a new wave of questioning around the need for organizations to be more collaborative. And also, I think one of the underpins to the changes we're going to be talking about today is, as you said at the beginning, the need to think about negotiation as more of a continuum. It isn't so much any longer just an event that occurs as part of the original contract settlement, but it's something that actually continues throughout the life cycle of that relationship. So we're going to talk today, our agenda is going to talk a bit about the forces that are driving that change. We're going to then talk about how is it that organizations are reacting to that, what are some of the things that they're doing, and we're going to focus in on 4 specific areas highlighted on the chart here today. We're then going to touch briefly on a couple of future trends and sum it all up with some critical elements. And at that point, I'm going to pass over to Richard to talk a bit, of course, about how automation is assisting in that particular shift. Indeed, in many cases, of course, it is really automation, it is our networked world that has been driving a lot of the changes that are upon us now. So it's only natural that in many ways our community has to start thinking more about the nature of the automation that we need in order to be able to respond effectively to a networked world. So, what are a couple of those forces? Well, certainly there are very few in our community, very few listeners today, I suspect, who would say that the world had got simpler. Indeed, for most organizations over the past few years, there is this continuous feeling that there is a growth of complexity, partly driven by the pressures for greater speed, partly, of course, by the shift in competition of competitors from new markets, our own need to internationalize our activities, and of course, the pressure that a community like ours faces on how do we deliver and demonstrate the delivery of more value add. So those are some very, very real pressures upon the community, and with all of that, of course, with the continuous oversight of costs and the pressure certainly not to dramatically expand resources, in some cases to reduce them, although fortunately many in our community have really been spared, I think, the pressures of reduction because management is understanding more and more the critical nature of contracting with negotiation practices to the sort of sustainable value of their trading relationships. But nonetheless, we're having to make choices. And one of those key areas that I think is a very interesting one is the elimination of repetitive, low-value negotiation. We can't afford to just continue negotiating stuff just because we always have. The traditional battle of the forms is a great example of that. So quite a lot of pressure to respond to that particular dynamic, and we'll touch on how that's manifesting itself. Secondly, certainly a much greater need for customer alignment and indeed supplier alignment, a growing understanding that terms and conditions really are significant in the behaviors they drive, that our choices over things like risk allocation are very material to the way that we determine the outcome from our contracts. So we need to have better understanding. We also need to drive greater efficiency through understanding of individual markets and industries, and we'll touch on that a little bit more. And thirdly, it's the focus on really the key goals of the business. And those goals have expanded from perhaps a traditional view of contracts as being largely about protection against downside risk, protection against nasty things that could happen to us, and also a focus today on, yes, but what are the terms, what are the procedures, what are the performance measures, etc., that are going to achieve greater value, the realization either of the contract goals or ideally exceeding the original contract goals, and where does contracting and negotiation play in the whole world of innovation? And that, of course, is part, again, of what takes us this value and innovation and the risk area into really needing to think about negotiation as more of a continuum. In other words, over the life cycle of an agreement, the nature of the risks can change, the opportunities for value change, and certainly the opportunities for innovation change. So it needs to be a far more dynamic process that's capable of realizing those various benefits or adjusting to the changes in risk. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what some of that is leading to. Well, certainly when it comes to the development of templates and standards, we're seeing the creation by organizations of far more adaptive terms and conditions. And we're going to talk shortly about how that's also changed some of the delivery systems that underpin it, and I'm sure that's going to be an area Rich is going to talk about even more. But it is necessary for organizations to do much smarter segmentation of their contracts, looking at the different relationship types, understanding the different markets in which they operate, and also perhaps equipping negotiators with better defined alternates or fallback positions. And simply delivering greater adaptability is not, of course, enough. We have to also make sure that we're undertaking more regular review to support how business needs are changing or how market norms are altering. I was in a meeting just the other day, for example, where there was very lively discussion about how do we actually get to understanding what the market norms are. And certainly one of the things we've seen at IACCM is a growth of organizations who are really asking us, what are the norms in our market? How do we actually discover the relative competitiveness of our terms? Obviously, our trading partners will give us a viewpoint, but how objective is that viewpoint? Are they really going to tell us what they actually get or what they would like to get? So this need to really make sure we have a continuous update of our underlying templates and standards is, of course, critical to not only being easy to do business with, but, of course, also easy to negotiate with. In other words, we come back to the point, eliminate unnecessary negotiation. If, for instance, we know that we're dealing with, say, the banking industry, which has very clear regulatory requirements around issues like data privacy, we need to make sure that the templates we're using when we talk with those clients is appropriate to that regulatory environment. This isn't a negotiable item. There's no point in just poking them in the eye by continually having terms and conditions that are not appropriate to their industry and business. Let's move on from that one and talk a little bit about the second area of reaction, that of contract assembly. Now, certainly in this area, organizations are really looking at how do we build more intelligent systems. So I just talked about the creation of templates, and here we now begin to talk about how do we deliver them out to the business. For example, can we tie those templates in some way into our CRM or SRM processes so that we understand the relative riskiness of different supply relationships or different customer relationships, and we tune our terms and conditions accordingly? Can we make sure that as we look at markets, industries, or individual opportunities, that we begin to assemble the contract terms and conditions out of those flexible templates without the need for extensive human intervention and drafting? The second area that organizations are looking at is certainly around more flexibility in their master agreements. Master agreements can bring us a great deal of efficiency, but they also, if we're not careful, can bring us a great deal of inefficiency through the need for regular revision, renegotiation, the risk that terms might be missing. So again, how do we link the concept of the master agreement with a contract structure that ensures appropriate and necessary terms are included when they're required, or that they're in some way overridden when they're not really relevant or required? Today's technologies really do mean that we can be more flexible, because we could have and should have a master record of exactly what terms a particular customer or supplier has already signed up to, and enable ourselves to readily and easily check whether this next deal, this next negotiation is already covered by the relevant terms and conditions. And thirdly, as I briefly touched on, making sure that the contract terms themselves have good alignment with the nature of the transaction and the relationship we're trying to form. We still have far too many situations where redundant terms are included into agreements, and they are contentious. Why would I want to sign up to something and have the precedent or perhaps some future issue arising which maybe makes that clause relevant? Equally, I need to make very sure that, of course, I haven't omitted key terms from this particular transactional relationship. And that is one of the areas where we know there's significant business losses today because relevant terms weren't included. So again, master records that really show exactly what has been covered, what has been negotiated and agreed, is of critical importance to organizations as they try to be more dynamic in the management of their relationships. Moving on to the third area, stakeholder engagement. The ability to involve the right people at the right time, the ability to ideally involve stakeholders, for example, in parallel rather than in sequence, to have more collaborative internal discussion whereby you can bring together stakeholder groups for virtual discussion, because, of course, very often our stakeholders are geographically dispersed. Bringing them physically together is not possible. And indeed, many of our negotiation teams today may be virtual as well. So how do we make sure that there is the engagement with the relevant experts and owners of certain policies or practices, and yet they can be involved and engaged on a timely and thorough basis, that their views are taken into account, and we make sure that our negotiation strategy, our fallback positions and so on are pre-agreed with the relevant stakeholders. One of the biggest irritations for organizations when they're negotiating is when they find they're dealing with a team that doesn't really have authority, that is continuously having to go back and refer back to other stakeholders to get approvals. There's also plenty of evidence that says the longer it takes us to come back and give an answer, the more likelihood there is of the other party having firmed up its position or maybe even changed its original demands. So there are plenty of good reasons why we need to make sure that our teams are well equipped and that the management of our organizational silos is something that is appropriate to our need to be speedy. But it is made more complex by the fact that with the growth of complexity, the number of experts seems to increase by the day. I remember in my early days of negotiation, if I ever needed to even speak to a lawyer, there was certainly just one company counsel that I would go and sit with, and we'd chat through how we were going to deal with this particular opportunity. Today, I may well be talking with 5 or 6. I may be talking with the expert on data privacy, the expert on intellectual property, the expert on, for example, resource acquisition, or whatever it may be. So this has become more complex, and it demands obviously more dynamic methods and systems to enable better stakeholder engagement. And of course, part of that is very much this question of how can I streamline the reviews and approvals associated with the opportunity. Which then leads us, of course, to the question of not just how do I equip central resources, but actually how do I equip the organization as a whole? And this has become a very, very big issue for management, and they're increasingly looking for groups like ours from procurement, legal, contract management, not only to raise our own skill and knowledge at doing stuff, but actually empowering the business to make better decisions and better judgments. Now, clearly, a lot of what I've already spoken about is the underlying framework that should enable empowerment. In other words, if we have templates, if we have pre-approved fallbacks, if we have understanding of how those are going to be used, if we've got more streamlined systems to enable better communications and inclusive communication, if we've got better timing of engagement through tie-in of contracting right up into the CRM and SRM type processes, all of those are really important things. But at the end of the day, we also have to look at ourselves increasingly as being knowledge centers that are really equipping the business with things like the 2-second advantage that's being written about these days, which is all about if you can give the answer 2 seconds faster than your competitor, then you have a real market advantage. So that means we've got to start thinking as a community far more about how do we provide the business, salespeople, business unit owners, project managers with on-demand information. Now, part of that may be through things like help desks, but it may also be through interactive media or through things like apps where they can simply go in and they can look up repetitive types of issues or questions, where they can get guidance on the use of the liquidated damages clause, for example. And then that can also be further supported by the increasing use of things like playbooks and more thorough online guidance, as well as training, both physical classroom training, but often, of course, online training. So all of these are very much at the forefront of what we're seeing as the leading organizations that are really looking at how to deal with the changing shape of negotiation. I said I'd talk about a couple of future trends, so let me just mention those. Well, we talked right at the beginning about more collaborative relationships, and certainly that's leading to more and more questions about what is the integration between contracts and relationship management. And so we are seeing a shift in the terms and conditions that we need to be thoughtful about, what we've termed here at IACCM, relational contracting. And that has very much changed the negotiation agenda and the timing of much of that agenda. It means that we are, for example, far more engaged in understanding and talking about what are the communication methods. How is things like change management going to be better handled within the contract? What about areas of joint working or joint problem solving? What would a good performance management technique look like in addition to the KPIs? How do we amend and update and change those over time, because they're not going to remain static? So all of these things actually require much more mutual discussion of how are we going to establish good governance together so that we actually share in the success of this particular relationship and we drive a good output or a good outcome from it. It also, interestingly, is beginning to shift a lot of the thinking around the role of the negotiator from being somebody who was perhaps a pure representative of their organization battling hard to try and get the other side to accept our preferred terms, into much more of a negotiator operating as a facilitator, both within their own organization, a critical role certainly for anybody who aspires to be a respected contracts or commercial expert, but also increasingly that the negotiators from the respective parties actually work quite collaboratively to facilitate discussion across and among their teams, often in a joint team session, where negotiation really does take on more as a form of a workshop as to how can we build a good structure and a good relationship that is actually going to be reflected in a good contract. The second area, which I think is of interest, is that in the area of commodity and non-strategic relationships, because I guess the collaborative relationships is obviously a subset of the overall relationship profile that we need to handle. But certainly at the lower end, the commodity and non-strategic relationships are increasingly getting addressed through what I'm terming auctioneering. That means that we're looking at areas like online assembly and pricing. So, for example, we have a commodity activity where we enable a customer or a supplier to actually look into the system and select. For example, maybe I would like to have 30-day payment terms rather than 60-day payment terms. So what's the quid pro quo? What's the impact of that perhaps on the price, for example? So that, of course, moves us to a world where negotiation will become increasingly virtual in its nature. So I think two very interesting trends, and many of you on the call may already be thinking about those types of things, and if you're not, you may want to be thinking about them. So what are the critical elements we've been covering here so far? I would suggest there are four of them. I think market insights, better market data, better feedback mechanisms is certainly one of them. The second one is, how do we really streamline the process, both in terms of the upfront selection and negotiation activity, but also in terms of the ongoing oversight and need for renegotiation? Thirdly, what are the sort of online tools and what are the information flows through those tools that we need to have in order to address this complex and changing environment? And fourthly, organizations are grasping the point that they really do have to think about this as a far more integrated approach. Negotiation does not stop at the time of contract signature. Indeed, in many respects, that suggests it's just beginning. So with all of that, Richard, I think I've probably given you plenty of meat to tackle in terms of where does automation then play in this environment.
Oh, thanks so much, Tim. Without a doubt, I think you've really set the stage in terms of the changing shape of the contracting process and really opened up a number of avenues for where automation can help address those challenges. So for my portion, I'd like to really focus on challenges and solutions, but maybe start with the process itself and defining the process. And through the course of a few poll questions, try to really establish some real-time benchmarks amongst the participants today to kind of get a gauge or a barometer of where we are as a group. So what I wanted to do then in that journey is talk a little bit about the definition of the process, broadly defined as the contract life cycle. So womb to tomb, if you will, that starts with the definition phase, really defining specifically what is the nature of the product or service that we want to purchase, what are the key terms that will govern that relationship, and then going through the proposing and negotiation stage, sort of the back and forth around negotiating pricing and terms, culminating with then actually the contracting phase, going through often very involved internal approval reviews and cycles to actually finalize an agreement. And then once that agreement is in place, implementing and managing, starting with making sure that it's visible so that people can start buying off of those agreements and utilizing them. But secondly, the utilization itself, tracking that it's being used and that the contracting party, let's say the supplier, in the case of a procurement contract that we're kind of focusing on in our discussion today, is meeting their service level agreements or key performance indicators, and culminating with the closing and recording, so end of life for that agreement. So that's obviously an ongoing process, most agreements existing for multiple terms, multiple years in many cases. But one of the key focus areas that technology has really been brought in to address is in fact that front end of the process, getting from creation to approval. So for instance, there's a benchmark here that says the best performers, average cycle time is 33 days to go from creation to approval, whereas average performance is about 40 days. So while contract lifecycle management entails this entire continuum, as a starting point, wanted to get a benchmark for where we are in that creation to approval process. So in fact, that's the first poll question. What is your creation to approval cycle time? So the first choice is greater than 50 days? Is it between 45 to 50, perhaps 40 to 45, which was about average, was the 40 based on the benchmark previously, or is it 35 to 40, 30 to 35, which would be approximating best-in-class performance, or perhaps less than 30. So this is starting from a specific need to purchase, to contract for supply, and getting from that stage to the actual approval of the contract itself. So we'll take a couple seconds for folks to answer and then see what we come up with for our benchmark. Okay, so the results are coming in now, and certainly if we establish best-in-class performance at around 30 days, only about 5% of the total appear to be at that best-in-class or better, which is not surprising. That in many cases, in fact, cycle times tend to extend well beyond 30 days. Looks like our largest group is above 50 days. So clearly there's a need to, just as Tim illustrated, streamline and accelerate the process in terms of the entire life cycle, but especially in the front-end creation to approval. So next slide. Thank you. So the typical challenges, and I'm going to focus on challenges, again, from the perspective of where automation can play, but boiling those down into, let's say, these 4 key ones, it starts with visibility. After all, agreements aren't visible across the enterprise. They can't be utilized from a compliance standpoint. And compliance really has multiple dimensions. Process compliance to make sure that the right people are reviewing and approving agreements, so compliance with regulatory issues like Sarbanes-Oxley, compliance from a purchasing standpoint to make sure that we're getting the right pricing and terms that were contracted for during the negotiation phase. And from a legal standpoint, that those agreements contain the approved standardized terms and conditions. So that's really the third one here, making sure that standardized terms are in place. And then cycle time, because after all, if the best agreements are negotiated, but it takes an inordinate amount of time to get those agreements in place and to get utilization, those benefits end up getting deferred. The negotiated savings, for instance, don't get implemented till further downstream, leading to the delay of the benefit realization. So with those challenges in here, to get a quick read on the audience here, which of these challenges would you say is the most critical for your organization? Is it getting visibility? Is it gaining compliance? Is it being able to standardize terms, or to streamline the cycle time for creation to approval processes, or is it something altogether different? And again, we'll give the group just a minute here to weigh in on that and kind of see where we end up. So interesting that we focused on the process right at the outset here, and cycle time is coming up as one of the biggest challenges. The number of different stakeholders that are involved, the degree to which those processes are still manual creates really a heavy burden on the organization, extending cycle time. Compliance coming in second, top of mind as well. So some of the key items here we'll touch on in more detail, then define not just what the challenges are, but hopefully where there are some solutions, and give you a glimpse of what those look like from an automation standpoint. Next slide, please. So starting with visibility, one of the first issues is just the fact that many of these agreements are what we call evergreen or auto-renewing agreements, and the fact that they often do auto-renew without any kind of intervention at all. So being able to prevent that by having a system of alerts ahead of time to be able to go in and actually go in and get ahead of that evergreen or auto-renewal type process. Making sure from a key contract term standpoint that those clauses or terms that create the most potential liability, examples being termination for convenience or some key aspects of risk mitigation such as liability, or negotiable payment terms, that those are very visible across the enterprise so that they can be managed appropriately. Speaking of contract management, one of the biggest issues in many organizations is contract ownership. Who in fact has ownership for the process, and recognize that that may change throughout that contract life cycle. So whereas a sourcing manager may be the principal owner during the creation to approval process, the contract owner from implementation onward could in fact be a different person. And having those stakeholders engaged throughout the process and visible to who has ownership at each stage is critical as well. Another key issue that we've seen across organizations is maintaining a contract hierarchy, effectively a parent-child type of relationship where you start with perhaps a master services agreement that has multiple sub-agreements or statements of work embedded under that and amendments, and the challenge being organizations want to be able to see all that in one place at one time. So in terms of visibility solutions, the starting point is often to create a central repository that's searchable across the enterprise to manage that information. Being able to then drill into those key terms that need to be tracked for each contract, having reporting across the agreements, and not just after the fact reporting capability, but a system of proactive alerts and notifications to prevent the auto renewal of evergreen agreements, as I mentioned. So what I want to do also is give you a glimpse to what that looks like from a technology standpoint. So many organizations have kind of started to go beyond the de facto contract lifecycle management automation tool, which tends to be Microsoft Word, and say those agreements into some type of a central repository. And they may have created an intranet, kind of a share drive or something like that. But most are now seeking to take the next step forward, which is to make that information that's centrally stored and aggregated in a repository truly searchable. And to do so, the starting point is to create metadata for those agreements that creates a common framework and structure that captures some of the key contract terms at a header level to make it searchable across. And in addition to having that metadata search, a full function repository will also offer a free text search capability. So for instance, if a user, a contract manager, a category manager, whatever they happen to be, wanted to take a look across the enterprise and find on a keyword basis, show me every agreement where there's the term rebate, because I'm really focused on making sure we're capturing all of the rebates that are available to us. This type of a keyword search will go across those agreements and really alleviate the challenge that most organizations experience using tools like MS Word, in that they can't find within the text of the agreement the pertinent terms or clauses that they're searching for. So from a compliance standpoint, the challenges then tend to be purchase price compliance. So one way of measuring that is purchase price variance. When do we have incidents of purchase orders being placed where the pricing doesn't agree with the contracted terms? Maverick spend. That's really about minimizing contract leakage, ensuring that those agreements are visible and available for users to buy off of those. And visibility then really gets to utilization. How do we ensure that those contracts are being utilized across the enterprise? So some strategies for achieving compliance, really matching those established contracts with actual spend. So tracking actual invoices paid against those contracts to be able to report back on contract utilization, or those incidences of maverick spending or contract leakage to address that appropriately. So that all points to the need for not only a robust contract management capability, but one that's tightly coupled or integrated with the procure-to-pay processes. So for instance, being able to ensure through integration with your P2P or ERP system that a purchase order actually refers to the contract when it's placed with the supplier as a way to safeguard and ensure that the proper pricing is achieved on the contract. The other idea here is to be able to identify not only pricing compliance, but also to make sure that rebates are being captured. So to, again, walk you through an example here of work in practice, the idea that you can create not just a centralized repository of agreements, that you can actually track performance and contract utilization. So in a full source-to-pay suite such as Zycus provides, we would integrate from our spend analytical tool, our spend analysis tools, to show actual spending against those contracts, or even if a customer weren't using our spend analysis tool, pull in accounts payable data feeds to be able to track contract utilization. So here you can see, actually in a very graphical way, which contracts are perhaps being underutilized and still have a lot of available capacity, if you will, and maybe those where the contract value has already been exceeded, so they may be an alert to go back and renegotiate those agreements. But the goal here too is to be able to drill down at any point here to go from the top level view, this graphical depiction of how contracts are being utilized, to be able to go into actual purchase orders to see where the spending is occurring. So I'll walk you through this example, and it's for a Dell contract, for example, where I see that the utilization was probably lower than I was expecting. So I want to go in and see what's actually being done. And the POs can point me then to actually enable the user to drill into line item level details to see exactly what's being purchased, and if in fact there is any non-compliant spend going on, where there's a purchase price variance at an item level, where there's a disagreement with the pricing and terms in the actual contract itself. So the third challenge, standardization. These are familiar to many organizations in that across different categories there are all types of different templates or different clauses that may apply. And getting beyond standard products or commodities into services spend poses a whole set of challenges where each one is somewhat unique. So that professional services would be a great example where each solution is somewhat different and needs to be accounted for, but the terms and conditions should be more standardized when buying professional services as well as products. The other issue that tends to be posed here is for global organizations trying to standardize templates across regions and across geographies is especially challenging due to different languages and different local conditions that have to be accounted for. So some of the standardization best practices, if you will, is leveraging libraries of standard clauses and terms, working with different stakeholders, identifying where there are category-specific requirements or geographical specific requirements, and making those available to the users based on their own profile of the type of category that they happen to be contracting for, and guiding them to the right template based on sort of a wizard-type survey interface that walks them through the process to make sure they're utilizing the correct standard clauses and terms, and then tracking those terms and identifying those that are often negotiated. So standard terms really don't end up being very standard in practice, presenting the users with authorized alternate or fallback terms that can be inserted as well. And then identifying services that are repeatedly purchased from vendors, and on occasion using a third-party boilerplate from a vendor as a standard template for the library. So supplementing your own template content with third-party agreements as well. And then defining the clause hierarchy and organizing it according to different geographical requirements so that by region you can deal with the differences as they exist. So here's a view then to what those standard template and clause libraries would look like. From a template standpoint, you see various examples from IT contracts to master services agreements, and then being able to track those as they move from the creation through approval process based on steps that may have already been completed, such as draft and approval, and showing you exactly where you are in that process and all the stakeholders that need to be involved to get to the finalization stage. Reporting, an important consideration here. So talking about compliance, for example, a big emphasis is placed on making sure that the standard clauses are inserted where they need to be in agreement. So here you see really a list of various clause types, and a very favorable use may not always be the case in practice. But the goal of the report would be to also track where it may be modified, where alternates may have been used, or where a fallback clause is inserted instead of the default. So the final challenge here, cycle time. And these are pretty self-evident. Approvals take too long. Redlining and negotiation, the back and forth process is tedious and time-consuming as well. Users don't have visibility, not just to the agreement, but to the approval process. They don't know who needs to sign off on which agreements based on category-specific or business unit-specific rules. And then the final stage also is fraught with inefficiencies in that signatures, the actual physical signing, printing out and signing of agreements, and scanning the executed documents back into the system takes too long as well. So to improve the cycle times with the CLM tool, the workflow approval process is automated, so you predefine those approvals based on specific category or spend threshold business rules. There's ways to streamline the stakeholder engagement process in that you don't need to send an entire agreement to every stakeholder to review. You can simply use the workflow tool to send a specific clause to a specific clause owner or expert, so only involving the people at the right stage in the process in the right area of content for their expertise that makes the most sense. And no need to take the final stage of the process offline either. Using e-signature, everything is automated, greatly compressing the cycle time, improving the efficiency and compliance. So a couple of final examples here. One is, as you go through this process, maintaining version control. So having visibility of side-by-side comparison of different versions of the agreement to see what's been changed by a contracting party, such as a supplier, in the red line, maintain the integrity of those versions. And of tracking overall cycle time performance. So on a given contract at any point in time, the system is date and time stamping the processes so that you know where are you against the type of benchmark that you're trying to set in terms of cycle improvement or efficiency. So maybe 30 is a good target for this one, but 48 days taking longer than expected. The reporting gives you the ability to intervene and find out what's holding up that process. So the final poll question I'd like to pose today here is to say, which of the following best describes the extent of procurement contract automation for your organization? So the choices here include really little or none, or perhaps your organization has taken, let's say, the first step with deploying a repository only, or maybe you've chosen to focus on the authoring process only, or maybe you'd say that you've got full automation, that you've got both repository and authoring capabilities in place. So I'll give you a second to choose one of those selections so we can kind of get an idea to what extent across the group today automation may have already been introduced into the contract lifecycle management process. So as the results come back, you know, this is consistent with what we've seen in the past too, where there are, you know, a fair number that have done a full automation that contains both repository and authoring. The vast majority would have currently little or no automation, or may have only taken, let's say, a repository where they aggregate those agreements, but haven't yet really automated the authoring and workflow approval processes. Some of the automation capabilities that I wanted to share with you, really solution to those key challenges, you know, that involve visibility, compliance, the standardization, et cetera. So best practices were what we intended to share today. And a final word here today is really on a conference that Zycus hosts solely for the purpose of sharing best practices. It's called Horizon. It comes up at the end of October, the 27th through the 29th in San Antonio, Texas, where we'll be covering contract management best practices in detail, along with other components of a full source-to-pay capability. And consistent with contract negotiation and in getting the best terms, there are some special incentive offers available to attendees of the webinar today as well. So thanks very much for your time. I know we have some time available now to take questions from this as well. Rohan?
Thank you, Richard. It has been a great discussion and great insights by our audience as well. And we'd like now to spend some time from the questions from our audience. And here's a question for Tim. At my company, we are under pressure to reduce negotiation cycle time. Do you have any suggestions on how we can get started with this?
Yeah, it's well, good and not uncommon question. Obviously, it's helpful if you've got a clear understanding of what's driving that particular pressure. Is it generic? Is it across all contract types? You know, as I think some of the answers in the chat that was going on illustrated, there isn't a uniform answer here. I mean, our own research on typical cycle times obviously shows a very real divergence between relatively, you know, simple standardized forms of agreement as opposed to perhaps solutions as opposed to more complex, you know, outsourcing type arrangements. So where are the pressure points? Is it generic? Is it across the board? Or is it something where you need to have particular focus on particular agreement types? Second, do you have any data? Do you actually have any understanding today of what your cycle times are? Obviously, it would be good if you had a baseline and knew roughly where you stood. Clearly, then, obviously, we could help you with data in terms of where that puts you relative to norms for your industry or your contract types. So getting that comparative data is, of course, another important element. To what extent can you begin to analyze the sources of time? You know, where is time being spent today? If you don't really know that, then it's again quite difficult to get targeted activity focused on the delay points. I mean, is the delay, for example, in review and approval? Is it because you're doing that sequentially rather than in parallel? would it in fact be better if you were spending more time up front planning and preparing for negotiation and less time physically in negotiation? Quite a few of our members have discovered that actually the earlier the involvement of the contracts and legal organization, the shorter the negotiation cycle time becomes. And the consequence being an overall quite substantial reduction, in many cases 20 to 25% reduction in cycle time. Do you have underlying templates, models, pre-agreed alternates or fallbacks? Who's authorized to use those? These are all, I think, the sort of obvious questions, Rohan, that would be amongst your list as you try and get started on a project of this sort.
All right, thank you, Tim. The next one is for Richard, and what are the best practice strategies for migrating legacy agreements to a central repository?
Yeah, great question. And, you know, as I mentioned, I think as was borne out by the poll responses, you know, creating that central searchable repository is often a first step for organizations that are looking to introduce automation into contract lifecycle management, and mainly it's because their agreements typically do live in an environment such as Microsoft Word, and the issue is they're not aggregated across the enterprise. They live in individuals' hard drives and so on, and they're not searchable. So the best practice is to take those agreements, the legacy agreements as they exist, upload them from a Word format, but in the process apply and extract key metadata information such that the repository becomes truly searchable. So some of the things are obvious. You'd want to capture the contract term, expiration date, payment terms, those kinds of things. But the other key is making sure, first in the definition phase, that you've captured, you know, all the key metadata that you want common across your agreements to make them truly searchable, and that the tools that you use have the flexibility to go beyond just standard header information to capture any kind of flexible fields that are important to your enterprise to make sure that you've got a truly searchable enterprise repository.
Okay, thanks a lot, Richard. The next one is, I think, Tim. More and more of our negotiations are international. How do we reduce the risk of misunderstanding or failing to deal with differences of business culture?
Well, certainly many companies are dealing more and more internationally, whether it's with their supply base or with their customers. Economic circumstances, the pressure on costs, the pressure on expanding markets and revenues are all driving many, many organizations to deal in markets with which they perhaps have little familiarity. The basic answer, of course, is to undertake some study, learn from others, read about it, use local contacts, make sure that you have actually understood and appreciated some of those fundamental differences. If the country, for example, does not use a similar legal system, then it's important to understand what the differences are. If business practice and business ethics are significantly different from your own, that too is something that's really important to understand. What's the underlying culture when it comes to negotiation? I mean, for example, is it a culture where the only way that you're going to eventually get agreement is by walking away? There are still certainly some cultures that feel that you've only reached the bottom line when you walk away, so until you walk away, they'll keep on pushing. So really having clear understanding of those sorts of fundamental points is just a basic of good practice. I think it's important to remember that culture drives behavior. Don't think that by negotiating, and particularly don't think that by imposing your terms and conditions, you've somehow changed local culture. You haven't. The behaviors will continue. So unless you actually invest in building understanding and better appreciation of each other's position, greater mutual respect, you're not going to be walking away with anything that has a great deal of value to it. I think one of the big questions that people have to ask themselves is, are we truly negotiators, or are we actually barriers to negotiation? There are still many in procurement, contract management, and legal who really act more as a barrier to variation and sort of seek to drive their position fairly unilaterally. That isn't negotiation. That is indeed imposition. And in international environments, it isn't likely to work all that well because you're not creating any framework of trust or respect within the relationship. So you're going to be having people who are looking to game you at every opportunity. So it's a very important question, and one which requires very significant thought if we're going to drive the sort of results that we hope for.
Thanks, Tim. One more for Richard here. How do you drive adoption with legal and other internal stakeholders as well as your external suppliers?
Sure. As with any new technology introduction, end user adoption is going to be a key success factor, and it really starts with ease of use. So having an intuitive type of interface and process is certainly key to this approach, but part and parcel of that too is managing the change by enabling users to continue to leverage what they may be comfortable with. So a great case in point is the fact that a Microsoft Word for certain components of the process, like redlining and markup, is the de facto standard. So a tool like ours that enables users, be they legal or the external suppliers or other internal stakeholders that get involved, to actually download and upload or import and export between the online automated contract management tool and Microsoft Word, so that they can do what they need to do offline in Word if they're more comfortable there, but ultimately bring that back, upload it back into the tool, whether they were a lawyer marking up the agreement or the supplier, so that the tool itself maintains the version control, is the system of record, the one repository, the one version of truth that's so critical to maintain. But that's a strategy for minimizing the change management impact, ensuring adoption as you go forward. And I think one of the things that really gets users excited across the business is just the fact that for the first time they have visibility. So a graphical depiction like I showed, where you can look at contract utilization, or you can search across all agreements with one keyword, is the type of thing that really gets users excited and drives their adoption and support of any new system like this.
All right. Thank you, Richard. This was a great Q&A session, and it was, in fact, an excellent discussion. And we'd like to thank both our experts, Tim Cummins as well as Richard Waugh, for sharing their experiences, insights with us. We thank also for their time and questions, which made the webinar very interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Goodbye.